Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome here this afternoon for today's talk. I'm Lauren Mengst. I'm a member of the Social Sciences Committee, and we're happy to bring you today's session. Number of things, cell phones, please mute them, and try to keep things fairly quiet so our instructor, our lecturer today can present his talk. We want to also welcome the crowd via Zoom in the HASS virtual classroom. Special thanks to our course technician, Gloria Goodwin, today for supporting our hybrid modality. Next month, we want to welcome Holocaust survivor Tova Friedman to our monthly program. This program will be hosted on Tuesday, October 10, and is entitled The Daughter of Auschwitz, named after her new memoir, as Tova was born into a Polish ghetto and liberated from Auschwitz at age 5. Tova will be joined on stage by her daughter, Taya. Tova will be available following the program to meet with you and sign copies of her memoir. You can purchase your own discounted copy of The Daughters of Auschwitz at Hope College Bookstore, Reader's World, or from the HASP office, where a limited number of copies will be available. On the day before Monday, October 9 at 3 o'clock, you can be introduced to Tova's story when we screen the documentary Surviving Auschwitz, written by HASP member Milton Usma. This is a free screening at the Knickerbocker Theater and will be followed by a panel featuring the film's director, writer, and producers. We hope you can join us for these incredible events. The HASP librarians also invite you to explore the newly curated collection of books and DVDs outside the classroom in honor of Tova's visit. Today, we're going to learn a little bit about Iran. Our speaker is Joel Toppen. Joel is from this area and attended Purdue University, where he had an MA in both and PhD in political science, and then joined the Hope faculty in 1997 and teaches U.S. foreign policy and global political economy. Joel had quite an honor of being selected by the student body as the outstanding educator at Hope, and has led various groups to foreign countries. During his talk today, if you have a question about a clarification or something that we're specifically talking about, you can raise your hand or interrupt, and we'll bring the microphone around. And if we bring it around, make sure you get your face close to the microphone so the people on Zoom and everybody in the audience can hear you well. Afterward, we'll have our usual question and answer session where you can ask other additional questions. With that information, I will turn it over to Joel, and we will look forward to his talk and to this presentation today.
Thank you all. I'm not going to put this over my ear yet because we're going to watch a bit of this video here that was provided. I think the analysis is mostly spot on, and then it will allow me to bounce off ideas that were introduced in this video. But I do first just want to thank everyone. Thank you, Lauren, for the kind introduction, and thank you to Gloria and Ian and everyone here. I joined the faculty as Lauren said, in 1997 at Hope, and it was shortly thereafter where I gave my first presentation to a HASP group. And then, of course, Renz Hoeksma would not be shy about asking me to participate in the Great Decisions program. And so I've been doing this for a couple of decades at least. And so Renz Hoeksma was a professor of mine at Hope College. I was able to take one class from him. And I think that was probably in 1990. And interestingly enough, the course I took at Hope from Professor Hoeksma was entitled Politics of the Middle East. So that was my main introduction to the politics of the Middle East was from Renz, who for a long time organized and ran this Great Decisions series. So, but I would also say that I, like the presenter here in the film, am trained as an American foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy specialist. I'm not trained as an Iranian politics specialist. I'm not an expert in Iranian politics. So I do understand a lot of what's going on there. And I, though, understand it through the lens of someone who's thinking about U.S. foreign policy. And as you'll see, or if you've maybe viewed the video before, but it takes a U.S. perspective. So looking at the crisis in Iran, looking at the domestic turmoil in Iran, but looking at it through the lens of U.S. interests and U.S. foreign policy. So the presenter, as I said, I think he gets it mostly. I'll point out a couple of areas where I think, I'm not so sure about that, where we might disagree a bit. But he has a fairly kind of monotone, straight ahead approach in his presentation. So there may be a couple times during the video where I'll stop it and try to point out something or reflect a bit on that to break it up to a certain extent. So here we go.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2023, an 8-lecture masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. Topic number 7 is the Islamic Republic of Iran, a perennial foreign policy challenge for the U.S. government. The topic is subtitled At a Crossroads because Iran today faces 2, if not 3, distinct futures. This is not the first time that Iran has been in such a position. Back in 1946, shortly after the end of the Second World War, the Iranian crisis was placed on the agenda of the UN Security Council, its first topic of consideration. The Soviet Union was placing enormous pressure on Iran to align with Moscow, and if not, it was encouraging the northern portion of the country to break away and proclaim independence. In 1953, the Iranians had 2 distinct paths to consider. One was democracy, though socialist, under a newly elected prime minister, and the other was to align more closely with the Western nations. In 1979, the gravest of all crossroads decisions was made. Early on in that revolution, it appeared that moderates would prevail, pushing Iran away from the dictatorship of the Shah and towards a Western socialist model. In the end, however, radicals took charge. The Islamic Republic of Iran was born. In 2023, Iran has no fewer than 3 paths moving forward. The first, and perhaps most likely, is that of the status quo, where the Islamic Republic remains, the Ayatollah stays in power, and the country is at odds with most Western powers. It could elevate its status in terms of power by acquiring usable nuclear weapons, or, as many hope, there could be a wholesale reorientation to the West through yet another revolution. Many point to a Shia spring underway in places like Lebanon and Iran as evidence that this new path may be taken. Iran's geostrategic location places it between hostile powers. The Saudi Arabians are on the other side of the Persian Gulf, long borders with Pakistan, Afghanistan to the east, and Iraq to the west. The United States has been deeply engaged in the Persian Gulf and Middle Eastern region since the Second World War. We've engaged our allies and our adversaries, fought a global war on terrorism that centered on this region, 2 wars with Iraq, one very brief and successful in 1991, and the other very long and painful that started in 2003. Israel, access to oil, and nuclear proliferation round out America's concerns and engagement in the Persian Gulf region. With each of these topics, Iran has played prominently. This is a country that is incredibly important to the United States, yet one with which we've had very little dialogue for sustained periods of time. That was not the case before 1979. The Shah was an American ally. His toppling led to the Islamic Republic, the taking of Western hostages, and deep-seated hatred between the two nations. Dialogue simply disappeared for decades on end. We re-engaged the Iranians under the Obama administration through the nuclear arms negotiations that ended with the arrival of Mr. Trump in the White House, the canceling of the deal, and the application of a max pressure campaign on the Iranians. The Biden administration has restarted nuclear arms talks. They've been rather limited in their scope, and there does not appear to be a smooth path forward for them. The key foreign policy questions we should ask relating to Iran: should we re-engage with the country? Is there any opportunity to find common ground? Can the nuclear arms deal be re-established? Will Iran go nuclear with or without a negotiated deal? And finally, is Iran really at another crossroads? Are we simply being optimistic? There are three main considerations for us before we consider U.S. foreign policy options. We'll look at how we lost Iran as an ally, the rise of the Islamic Republic after 2000 in particular, and Iran at a crossroads today. We begin with the old Iran, post-World War II. The United States had several goals as we looked to the Middle East. One of the most important was access to oil, the lifeblood of industrial societies and the Western world. We also wanted to contain the Soviet Union, to keep communism at bay, and finally to counter terrorism. There were several allies in the region that were considered absolutely essential to the successful completion of our mission. One was Turkey, an ally after World War II and a member of NATO beginning in 1952. In 1967, Israel became one of our closest allies, and in between the two, beginning in 1953 especially, Iran was central to our foreign policy in the region. All three allies, pillars of U.S. foreign policy. We won Iran, if you will, in 1953. It was the aftermath of a national election when Mohammad Mossadegh was elected, a leftist who threatened to nationalize oil fields. The Western powers and the Seven Sisters, the major oil companies, had dominated oil production from ground to market. Many in the Middle East believed that the people of the countries should benefit from the oil found underneath their soil. Concerned by the possibility of losing its access to Iranian oil, the United Kingdom led an international boycott of oil from Iran. There was much talk of an invasion from either the United States or the United Kingdom. We ultimately decided to use the CIA in order to create a street demonstration that propelled a new ally to power in the form of the Shah. Here we see Mohammad Reza Shah, a pro-Western Iranian leader who sought to industrialize and modernize Iran, at the same time brutally repressing his people. The demonstrations that began in 1978 against the Shah were largely driven by young moderates seeking to be more like Western Europe, socialist, democratic, and more liberal. It was not long, however, before radical religious elements took over the Iranian Revolution, driving home the Islamic Republic and welcoming the return from Paris of the Ayatollah himself, who became the spiritual leader of the new Islamic Republic of Iran. Hatred for Israel, the West, and the United States was endemic in Iran thereafter. Here we see images of Western hostages that were taken, held captive for 444 days, dooming the presidency of Jimmy Carter. The decision to move away from moderation towards radicalism, one of the more important revolutions of the 20th century. The societal hatred is reflected in murals such as this. The Iranians detest the Americans, they do not trust us, and we return the very same feelings towards them. So what has happened in Iran since?
I just want to stop it there and point out one of my disagreements with the presentation. So far, I think he's got it about right. However, he mentioned also this societal hatred, and earlier he spoke of that the nations, these nations, deep-seated hatred between the nations. And this is maybe a technical point, but we use the word nation and state and country and nation state. We use these terms interchangeably. However, there is an important distinction. So the governments or the ruling elites may have a deep-seated hatred for each other, but usually we mean nation, we mean the people. And then the state represents the government. If you put the people and the state together, you have a nation state. So I would counter that the people of Iran and the United States have a deep-seated hatred to each other. I would push back against that. The revolts of 2022, and we're coming on the anniversary for, maybe we'll have a repeat or an escalation of those revolts. You know, these are people who identify with the protesters in Iran. They identify with the West. They don't hate the West. They want to be more like the West, have freedom, political freedoms, have democracy, be able to wear what they would like to wear. So I want to push back a little bit against that. So the U.S. has a problem with the government of Iran and the ruling elites of Iran. That, yes, but not necessarily. It's not necessarily the case that the people are pitted against each other with this deep-seated hatred. The other thing I want to point out at this point is the interests that he identified at the beginning. Right, he identified oil, that the U.S. has an interest, and I would agree with that. The U.S. has an interest in maintaining access to oil. The alliance and support of Israel is certainly an interest in the region, and also particularly with Iran. And then he also said the containment of the Soviet Union is an interest. And then he made the comment that rounds out the U.S. concerns. Like, you know, that's about it. And so it struck me that, well, what about freedom? What about democracy? What about human rights? Does the U.S. have an interest or concern? Right, regardless of how it may impact the U.S. in terms of, all right, the U.S. obviously in the Cold War has a strategic interest in containing the Soviet Union, and we have this material interest, of course, in access to oil. But what about principles? All right, what about values? What about, we have an interest in democracy or freedom or the recognition and realization of human rights everywhere for all people, that is an interest, a concern for the United States. And so that is kind of washed away. You know, the idea is, of course, he talks about realism and realpolitik approaches later, but that is kind of the idea of realism, that we have to pursue strategic material interests, and we don't have the luxury of worrying about values and principles and morality and human rights and freedom and democracy. Maybe that would be nice, but only if that helps advance our material self-interest. So that's a question that we will come back to. I will come back to, and I imagine maybe there'll be some comments or questions about that as well.
The revolution. We can chart the power level of Iran dating back some 50 years, a full decade before the Iranian Revolution. I would plot Iran's power level over that time along these lines, dividing the chart into 4 distinct time periods. There was the slow decline of Iran under the Shah, the devastating 8-year war with Iraq, which began in 1980, pushing Iran to its lowest power level. Following that conflict, for about a decade, Iran was boxed in. And then we see the power surge that began around 2001, which is largely attributable, in my opinion, to flawed American policy towards the region. This was the time of the greatest success of U.S. foreign policy. It's genuinely unfortunate that Iran managed to escape the box and rise in power. What exactly caused Iran's power to rise? An improved geostrategic position, a nuclear weapons program that nearly reached the point of viability, and finally splintered opposition powers. The geostrategic location of a country is defined as its location relative to other powers. Is it surrounded by hostile, large, and capable countries, or are they distant from the borders? For Iran, there were nothing but adversaries when the Iran-Iraq War ended. America's military might was all around the country. A NATO ally in Turkey in the upper left-hand corner, significant American naval positions just outside the Persian Gulf, and then American troop positions in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Kuwait. Adding to Iran's geostrategic troubles was an Iraq still led by Saddam Hussein, the same individual who invaded the country a decade earlier. And to the east there is Afghanistan under the Taliban with the influence of Osama bin Laden, an adversary of the Islamic Republic. As you can see, 30 years ago, Iran was completely boxed in, diminished in power. Everything changed after 2001. The United States went to war in Afghanistan in response to the 9/11 terror attacks in New York and Pennsylvania. In so doing, we toppled a government, the Taliban, and chased bin Laden, a terrorist, who were adversaries of Iran. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, another adversary of Iran, weakening the Western Front. As a result of these two interventions, Iran was no longer hemmed in, it was effectively out of the box because of its changed geostrategic position. Conflicts related to the Arab Spring in places like Syria, Egypt, Yemen, among others, further gave Iran opportunities for influencing affairs in neighboring countries. Here we can see a graph of the Arab Spring, the revolt across North Africa, and the Arab world that undermined their solidity and empowered the Iranian government. Next, as a driver of Iran's power rise, its nuclear weapons program. As you can see from this graph, we're not talking about Iraq in the 1980s, which had a single reactor. The Iranian nuclear program is spread out throughout the country. It is hidden and protected in mountain ranges and very difficult to get at. The question is, why does a nation in general, Iran in particular, pursue nuclear weapons capabilities? Historically speaking, there are many reasons, the most obvious of which is sheer power. Having a nuclear device greatly increases a country's military capabilities. Next is military deterrence. This prevents a nation from invading you if you've got the capability of devastating them with a nuclear strike. Keep in mind that George W. Bush talked about an axis of evil in the world. This is shortly after the 9/11 attacks. He listed Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as members of that axis of evil. Countries that could not be reformed from within could only be changed from without, meaning a U.S. invasion. The U.S. invaded Iraq. Iraq, of course, had no nuclear deterrence. It did not invade North Korea, which had nuclear weapons, beginning in 2006. The message to Iran was clear. If you've got nuclear weapons, you may be safer from a U.S. invasion. Nations, such as the United States in 1945, developed nuclear capabilities for offensive purposes to end a world war. There's also the lure of status. Only 9 countries today have nuclear weapons, and that means that if you possess them, you show a scientific prowess that few others possess. And finally, one could pursue nuclear weapons as bargaining leverage, to have something to bring to the table in order to negotiate a better relationship moving forward. In 2012, more than a decade ago, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went before the General Assembly and said that Iran was within 90 to 180 days of breakout, meaning it was very close to possessing nuclear weapons, that economic sanctions had fundamentally failed, and a more robust policy needed to be taken to address the issue of Iran's nuclear weapons program. The problem back then and today is there are very few good options for dealing with an Iranian nuclear weapons program. We can economically sanction the country, and we've done so for more than a generation. This graph shows us the effectiveness or lack thereof of economic sanctions in dealing with Iran's nuclear program. The red bar represents nuclear weapons capability, and the line that you see there is the progress in that direction. Significant sanctions were applied by the United States beginning in 2000, along with our allies, to prevent Iran from developing nuclear capabilities, yet throughout that decade, the number of Iranian centrifuges and overall progress continued to increase. The deal was struck in 2014, progress was diminished, the deal was withdrawn from by the U.S., maximum sanctions were applied, and Iran today is closer than ever to nuclear weapons capability. This tells us that sanctions alone simply will not prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon.
We go. I want to highlight a couple of the points that have been made there, and I'm really glad that the presenter mentions there are a few good options. And so oftentimes in foreign policy, it's leaders, decision makers are faced with, okay, we have bad policy A, we got bad policy B, or we got bad policy C, pick one. So there are trade-offs, as he says, in making these decisions. And it reminds me of an old military saying that the enemy gets a vote. Right. So ideally, yes, we don't want Iran to be able to acquire nuclear weapons. We would prefer that Iran didn't use such brutal repression. We would wish that Iran would not be supporting terrorist militias, anti-Western, anti-U.S. Militia groups throughout the region in the Middle East. But unfortunately, the enemy gets a vote. And this is a fundamental kind of distinction. Do we be tough? Should the U.S. be tougher on Iran? Certainly Netanyahu would espouse this. I'm going to talk about the prisoner exchange, the New Deal that was just announced this week. We're going to get to that. And you see mostly Republicans coming after the Biden administration saying, you're capitulating, you're giving in to them. We need to be tougher. We need to be tougher. On the other side, folks say, well, what happens when we get tougher? Supposedly, right? Then they get closer to nuclear weapons. So as flawed as the nuclear deal was, we had to make trade-offs. Yes, it was not a good policy, but what are our options, right? And so they would argue that if you want Iran to move quicker to nuclear weapons, then yeah, get tough on them, and you'll get the exact opposite of your goal. And so that's an important point. When it comes to the nuclear weapons and the acquisition of nuclear weapons, I do agree with the analysis there that the lesson of the U.S. reaction to the 9/11 attacks, we identify this axis of evil, right? And we go after the one without a nuclear weapons program. And so the lesson of Kim Jong-un, of the mullahs in Iran, that's why we're pursuing nuclear weapons. That's exactly why we're pursuing nuclear weapons, to provide this deterrence so we will avoid the fate of the Taliban or of Saddam Hussein. And so the incentive might have been the opposite of the intention. And then also another example when it comes to nuclear weapons, or I want to talk about the North Korea example and then also the Libyan example in terms of development of nuclear weapons and how do we prevent the proliferation, especially from potential adversaries, potential enemies of the United States. The case of North Korea, right? As soon as they began developing a nuclear weapons program and started working on it, every single U.S. administration, Democrat and Republican, said it's unacceptable. Right? There's consistency. There's not a partisan difference on this one. The Democrats said it's unacceptable. We will not allow North Korea to acquire a nuclear weapon. Republican administrations, we will not allow, right? It's not acceptable, right? No. And what happened? North Korea acquired nuclear weapons. They were the 9th country to join the nuclear club. And so it's an interesting case because essentially, the way I break it down, the U.S. made a calculation that if it's unacceptable, what costs are we willing to pay to prevent North Korea from acquiring a nuclear weapon? And essentially, it seems to break it down, maybe to oversimplify it, the decision was it's not worth a war. Right? Are we willing to go to war to prevent North Korea from acquiring a nuclear weapon? And it seems that the answer was no. Part of the risk of such a war, of course, was that China would then intervene on behalf of North Korea, as they did in the 1950s with the Korean War. So there was much at stake and much potential cost to try to live up to, to kind of walk the walk. The talk was no nuclear weapons, unacceptable. We're not going to allow that. Okay, well, what are you going to do about it? And it seemed that we weren't willing, the U.S., and this is bipartisan as well, Republicans and Democrat administrations both saying, yeah, it's not worth a war and a potential, great power war with China's potential involvement. And then the example of Libya. So Muammar Gaddafi, the former dictator of Libya, who was ousted as part of the Arab Spring, he had pursued a nuclear weapons program, and the United States had a successful diplomatic effort to convince him, say, hey, we're not going to try to overthrow you from power. We're not going to have a CIA planned coup. We won't try to overturn your reign of power, but in exchange, you have to get rid of your nuclear weapons program. Right, and your weapons of mass destruction program. And so a deal was reached and it was successful. And wow, good job. We convinced a potential enemy, an adversary for sure, to give up the nuclear weapons program. That's a success. The problem is, of course, that the other dictators around the world saw how it ended for Gaddafi. What ended up happening? He was removed from power. And from the view of Putin, from the view of Kim Jong-un, from the view of dictators and authoritarians around the world, it was not just a domestic uprising that got rid of Gaddafi, that got rid of Mubarak in Egypt. From their perspective, it is all the US and the West pulling the strings, fomenting these uprisings, which actually, from their perspective, are more like the 1953 coup, orchestrated or at least supported strongly by the CIA. So that's another example. One, while we're on the issue of the proliferation of nuclear weapons, one interesting case, and he does reference it later, is South Africa. South Africa is the only country to develop a nuclear weapons program and then to give it up. And this, of course, was after the end of the apartheid rule and the coming to power of Nelson Mandela and democracy coming to South Africa. So there's, he says, maybe we're just being too hopeful, but there is some hope. When we saw these protests last year, what if, I'm not betting on it, but we've been surprised before. What if democratic revolution comes to Iran, and maybe they follow that example of South Africa and say, yeah, we're going to join this Western-led community of nations, we're going to follow the rules, and we're going to give up our nuclear weapons program. Maybe that is overly wishful thinking.
Decade, the number of Iranian centrifuges and overall progress continued to increase. The deal was struck in 2014. Progress was diminished. The deal was withdrawn from by the U.S., maximum sanctions were applied, and Iran today is closer than ever to nuclear weapons capability. This tells us that sanctions alone simply will not prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon. Our second option is to assassinate scientists, which we, along with the Israelis and other allies, have done for the last couple of decades. This indeed does slow down Iran's progress, but it by no means ends it. War is an option that many people support. I guess the first question is, who's going to wage it? Certainly not the Israelis. They don't have a military designed for long-range sustained combat. Iran is simply too far, the battle is too complex, the targets are too greatly protected, and the air defense systems are too much for the Israelis to overcome without significant losses. The thought of an American invasion of Iran, given the troubles we've had in the two neighboring countries of Afghanistan and Iraq, have to be very, very slim. It leaves us really only with one option, and that is an agreement with Iran, a nuclear deal to slow, if not end, the program. So what did the Iran nuclear deal look like? 6 major powers joined together: the US, the UK, Germany, and France, along with Russia and China. They confronted at the diplomatic table the Islamic Republic. The end result is called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, an agreement by which Iran would give up much of its nuclear capabilities in exchange for the end of sanctions. As the negotiations got underway, the 7 powers staked out their position. Desiring a very weak accord, not surprisingly, was Iran. France could be found at the other end of the spectrum. Among the 6 major powers, it sought the strongest possible deal, hemming in the Iranians. Russia and China would be placed there, with the final 3 Western powers, including the United States, somewhere between China and France. When the negotiations proved fruitful, a deal was struck. I would place the deal roughly there on the scale. Not quite everything the Americans wanted, but clearly closer to our end of the spectrum than the Iranian one. The deal that was struck was a limited trade-off between Iran and the Western world. It would forego its nuclear facilities, allowing international atomic energy inspections of all of its program. In exchange for that, Western sanctions would be relieved and investment in trade would be allowed. The focus of this joint comprehensive agreement was solely the nuclear weapons program of Iran. It did not address the myriad of challenges that remain on the agenda, from Iran's support of international terrorism to its position on Israel, its influence in Syria and Lebanon, the ongoing war in Yemen, among many other issues of concern. It was generally understood that the only way that Iran would come to the negotiating table is if it felt maximum pressure from all major economies. Before negotiations, the U.S. led Western powers in sanctioning Iran, but China and Russia still invested there. Trade was vibrant between them. A deal was struck among the major powers. If everyone sits down at the table, China and Russia agree to divest from Iran, to join the sanctions regime. Yet once the negotiations were complete and a deal was struck, all sanctions would be lifted against the Iranians, allowing not only Russia and China to invest, but France, the UK, and Germany as well. When the deal was struck, the United States moved a little closer towards normal trade relations. However, it was only because we were lifting our sanctions. When Mr. Trump was elected in 2016, he quickly took the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal, placing us back on the sanctions end of the spectrum. This is where we stand today. It's a policy similar to the one that we pursue with Cuba, in which the U.S. and U.S. alone is sanctioning the targeted country. Even our allies are trading and investing in Iran today. The great powers, in other words, will trade with Iran, with or without the U.S. on board. This greatly reduces our leverage should we return to the table and seeking a new agreement. And finally, explaining the rise of Iranian power since 2000 is the splintered opposition around it. This is a country that really should be boxed in forever. You've got Turkey and the United States as NATO allies, Israel and Arab states hostile to Iran, Afghanistan under the Taliban, China and Russia, which do not want to see further nuclear weapons spread, including to the Islamic Republic. And yet all of these countries have weakened their own position. Israel and Turkey have been in an ugly spitting match for the last decade. The Arab alliance is in name only. There is no such thing. Even the Gulf Cooperation Council spends more time battling itself than it does the Iranians. Afghanistan is a complete disaster. China and Russia have prioritized trade and investment over nuclear weapons negotiations, leaving the United States isolated. We, of course, change our mind on most every foreign policy issue with each new U.S. president, which means we cannot pursue a consistent policy towards Iran. Iran has become more deeply involved in the war in Ukraine, providing the Russians with drone capability to strike both military and civilian assets in that country. If we find convincing evidence that Iranian drones are being used by the Russians, the United States must respond to this with exceedingly painful actions that will sound the alarm bell in Tehran that there will be a very high price to pay if it supports Russia in its illegal ongoing war in Ukraine. China has taken things one step further, signing a 25-year strategic partnership with Iran covering areas like trade, security, politics, and culture. It reflects Iran's new Eastern-looking policy to counter American max pressure, and of course for China, there's that Iranian oil and natural gas that it desperately needs for its economy. There is talk today about a possible Shia Spring, one that parallels the Arab Spring that began in December of 2010, when conflict in tiny Tunisia quickly spread throughout the Arab world. Governments in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen all were tumbled by popular protest, and in Syria a civil war started that is now entering its second decade. The shock of the Arab Spring did wear off, to the point that by the time we get to 2020, there's very little discussion about it. But now the talk is about a new Shia Spring in Shia-dominated countries like Iraq, Lebanon, and in today's case study, Iran. It all began in Iran when a young woman was killed during a protest by the Iranian security forces. Massive protests across the nation ensued, making headlines across the globe. Is Iran really at a crossroad today, or are we simply being overly optimistic? If it were at a crossroad and things broke our way, it would mean regime change, another revolution, and maybe even pointing Iran in the direction of moderation. We've been shocked when countries change course dramatically very quickly. South Africa did so in the 1990s, from white minority rule to democracy and an end to the nuclear weapons program. Many hope the same will happen in Iran someday. The odds, however, are with the status quo. The strength of the Iranian regime and its Republican Guard mean the odds of the moderates taking power are relatively slim. It does mean, however, that Iran is likely to continue to crack down and increase the power of the government. Iran today is authoritarian, which means it controls government and all powerful institutions. It is transitioning, however, to totalitarianism. This is when a government controls all aspects of its citizens' lives. Everything that is done is controlled by the government. And profoundly, of course, anti-Western, anti-Israel, and anti-the United States. If Iran is at a crossroads, these are the two directions that it could take.
I want to introduce a third option. He mentioned
authoritarian, which means it controls government and all powerful institutions. It is transitioning, however, to totalitarianism. This is when a government controls all aspects of its citizens' lives. Everything that is done is controlled by the government. And
including how people are to dress. The Mahsa Amini was the young woman, 22, 24 years old, who was arrested by the morality police a year ago and imprisoned, and then she was killed in prison. And this is what sparked these massive protests and uprisings throughout Iran. That I just want to mention, though, that so the assumption is that if there is another revolution, these liberal, Western-leaning forces, young folks, if they are able to throw off, to usher in a new revolution, the idea is, I mean, he does put a question mark, but that the idea is that they'll be more open to the West, more friendly to the West, maybe even somewhat democratic, or it's the status quo. I think a third option that, I'm not an expert on this and I wouldn't place any bets, but I would not be surprised if what we see the military break with the mullahs. So we have this kind of M&M alliance between the ruling clerics, the mullahs, Ayatollah Khamenei as supreme leader, and then we have the military, the Revolutionary Guard forces, and they have a kind of alliance, right? The military is supporting the Islamic Republic and the current rule. But there's a scenario in which if we have a massive unrest throughout the country, these out of control protests and demonstrations, and the grip is slipping, there's a good chance, from my view, that the military then could move in, take control of the government, push the mullahs out, and establish a military dictatorship that would not necessarily be one of moderation or pro-Western, but would likely still strongly pursue a nuclear weapon program. So whether this would be an improved situation or not, remains to be seen. All right, we just have a couple more minutes.
Profoundly, of course, anti-Western, anti-Israel, and anti the United States. If Iran is at a crossroads, these are the two directions that it could take. Why I don't think it's likely that a revolution would succeed in the country is reflected in the difference between 1979 and the current situation. Back then, a very weak and declining Shah of Iran faced a very strong popular movement. Today in Iran, however, the regime is quite capable and the popular movement is modest at best. This is an indication that radical change is likely not underway in Iran in 2023. Foreign policy options. We'll take a look at Iran from the perspective of the 4 foreign policy approaches I've outlined in this course. Wilsonian international liberalism says we should stay engaged with Iran, seek a deal to curb its military capabilities, especially along nuclear lines, and encourage protesters to stand up for their rights and demand government change. A more conservative realpolitik approach would support the anti-Iranian coalition around the country, building up Saudi Arabia, finding opportunities if they exist in Iraq, and strengthening the anti-Tehran coalition. The neoconservatives call for military intervention. This is a classic example for them of a country that needs its government toppled so that the people can express their willingness to be free and democratic, changing the direction of the country. Similar to our invasions in Afghanistan and Iraq, we would not only invade and topple, but fix the country for the future. America Firsters embrace Israel. They talk more strongly about protecting it from threats such as Iran and focus on energy independence as a way of weakening Iran's influence in global oil markets. 4 perspectives and 4 very different foreign policy prescriptions. Thank you as always for joining us. Future. America Firsters embrace Israel.
Okay. So we got through that. All right, a few points I want to highlight. And first of all, I want to try to provide a little bit more context for the anti-American sentiment. You know, the motto of the Islamic Republic of Iran since the beginning in 1979 has been death to America. And so I want to kind of put that idea in context a bit, not to provide an apology for that view, but to try to put it in a bit of context. So 1953 is crucial, right? So the Iranians, and especially the ruling government, the mullahs, the conservatives, with the current folks in power, they believe that the U.S. is adopting a death to Iran approach. Right? That we are the ones going after Iran, trying to eliminate the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so it's simply kind of a matter of self-defense. It's very similar really to the rhetoric that we see from Vladimir Putin, that the war in Ukraine, he says, we had no choice. We had no choice. They were coming after us. The West is coming. They're moving NATO closer, right? And they're coming after me. They're trying to destroy Russia. And so we had to defend ourselves. And so 1953 is really important, right? So the CIA-led coup that upends a democratically elected, or at least popularly elected, Mossadegh, right? And so this is a really interesting case. Couple of things that are interesting about it, at least from my perspective. And one is this concept of blowback, the idea that when the CIA or the U.S. takes covert action, secret action to undermine a potentially pro-Soviet Union government during the Cold War, that this initiates a blowback, a pushback, resentment, hatred of the U.S. even. We don't like the U.S. intervening. We don't like the U.S. meddling. But the blowback is mostly, the concept is that it's hidden from the American people because the action was secret, it was covert, and we didn't know that the U.S. had overthrown a popularly elected government in the Middle East and replaced it with a dictatorship, essentially. And so this helps to explain this defensiveness on the part of the Iranian regime to say, you're after us. You have always been after us. And what are you after? You're after oil. Right? You have all this talk about democracy and freedom and human rights, but we know what you're really after. You're after global hegemony. You want to be the only reigning superpower. And of course, you're after the oil. And the problem with Mossadegh was, it was alluded to in the presentation here, was that what was wrong with Mossadegh? Well, he was left-leaning. He was kind of a democratic socialist, but he threatened to nationalize the oil. Right, so the United Kingdom and the United States said, then we may not have access to that oil, and so the United Kingdom and the United States conspired to remove the Mossadegh regime. And so the other thing that's really interesting about this case is that it highlights what we see kind of throughout the Cold War, that the United States, of course, during the Cold War was fighting for democracy, capitalism, and with its democratic allies, and pitted against the Soviet Union and its communist allies. And so it was democracy versus communism. And the U.S., of course, on the side of promoting democracy. But the reality during much of the Cold War, in many instances of the Cold War, is that the U.S. pursued not a pro-democracy agenda, but pursued anti-communist agenda. So what this means is then we were perfectly willing to work with and support and put into place non-democratic leaders, authoritarians, autocrats, if they committed to the United States to reject communism and to reject the Soviet Union. So there was an old phrase during the Cold War, it's been attributed to different people, including Henry Kissinger, but the idea is like, yeah, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB, meaning, yes, he's a dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko and the DRC, Pinochet and Chile, the Shah in Iran. Yeah, these might be dictators, but they're our dictators in this global struggle against the Soviet Union and against communism. So, and we're still seeing the lingering effects of that. And then, of course, 1979, we have the revolution. And I think that's I'm glad he centered on this, that when the uprisings begin in 1978, they're most, you saw the picture of people, young students, college students in blue jeans and long hair, and they've supported democracy and they supported freedom. And that's why they were rejecting the rule of the Shah and his dictatorship. And then the radicals were able to kind of co-opt the revolution. So they ended up winning the revolution and taking power. And so as we look to the possibility of revolution, another revolution in Iran, that's something, of course, to keep in mind, the unpredictability of it. Like, okay, even if the mullahs are toppled, even if the Islamic Republic is ended and there is a type of revolution, who's going to win that revolution? And we can think of the Russian Revolution in 1917 also, that had moderate forces, liberal forces that would be more aligned with liberal democracy, but it was the radicals that ended up seizing power, in large part due to their willingness to use such utter brutality. And then we kind of skipped over in the presentation 1980 to 1988. So the Islamic Revolution happens in 79. The Islamic Republic of Iran is created, and shortly thereafter, Saddam Hussein and Iraq invade Iran, and they fight this brutal 8-year war. And in that contest, in that battle, that 8-year war, the United States sides with Iraq, not to the extent that we're supporting the Ukraine right now with $50 billion of support. So not quite that much support, but we shared intelligence. And what we feared, the US feared at the time, was that Iran would be able to take over the region and become a regional superpower, and obviously anti-Western, and spread this anti-Western idea and spread this death to America idea throughout the region. And the US, of course, wanted to counter that. But the war throughout the 80s also is instructive in terms of thinking about this supposed axis of evil, right? That somehow North Korea and Iran and Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, created this kind of axis, and they were working together to terrorize the West and the US in particular. And Iraq, Saddam Hussein led Iraq, and the current government of Iran, which was in power throughout, right, since 1979, they were not allies. They're not friends. The idea, Saddam Hussein being a Sunni Arab, and so in Iran, you have Persians, primarily the majority of the population. In Iraq, you have majority of the population are Arabs, so they're not brothers or sisters in that sense. But currently, the government of Iran and Iraq are both Shia dominated and Shia-led. During the rule of Saddam Hussein, Saddam was a Sunni Arab, roughly 20% of the population. And so this idea of the war of 2003, often it's quipped, who won the U.S. war against Iraq begun in 2003, who won the war? And the answer is Iran. It massively expanded Iran's influence in Iraq. Now they have a friendly government right next door. They allowed them in the parlance of the presenter to get outside of the box, to not be pinned in. Now they have a government right next door that's friendly to them, and rather than a government that wanted to invade Iran and threaten Iran. So the influence of Iran in Iraq is significant. It's supporting militias, anti-Western, anti-US militias, or terrorist groups, if you prefer that language. And so it greatly kind of enhanced Iran's position. not just in Iraq, but also in the region. One thing I want to clarify about the Iranian government, it's two-tiered. There are really kind of two governments. On the one hand, you have the mullahs, the supreme leader, and Khamenei, the Ayatollah, and his guardian council or council of guardians. These are the clerics, these are the ruling mullahs, and they have ultimate authority, kind of a veto power, right? They have ultimate authority over the entire government. But we also, in a kind of another tier or lane of the Iranian government, are the popularly elected legislature, the parliament, and the popularly elected president. Now, some of these elections had been fairly democratic, and sometimes over the years that the Iranian people would vote in a reformist who would try to move Iran maybe in a more liberal democratic direction, opening up some freedoms. And sometimes they would vote for hardliners. Currently, the elected president of Iran is a hardliner. And of course, we have concerns that that the elections have not exactly been free and fair, right? That the mullahs have rigged the elections so that they would have their preferred candidate. Of course, when we had a democratically elected president and government in Iran, if they tried to push reform too much, of course, then they got squashed by the ruling mullahs. So, you know, there are these two competing types of government in working in Iran. The elections have long been able, over the years, to kind of channel political discontent, to channel or absorb political conflict, to say, oh, and the candidates don't always agree. The parties don't always agree. They're presenting kind of different visions, and there's political pluralism and competition. And so Iranians can then feel like, yes, we're debating, we're being heard, we're participating, we're choosing our government, or at least an element of it. And so whether that will be able to continue, of course, remains to be seen. There are important parliamentary elections coming up in March of 24. So that's a really kind of something on the horizon that we'll be looking at to see how free and fair they are, if there are protests, if there's political violence surrounding those elections. We'll be watching that. I was chatting with Lauren earlier about the great timing of this series, because they choose these, you know, a year ago or plus, and they present the, you know, by the time they film this, you know, it's not exactly yesterday, but the timing was really great. And I'm sure many of you have read the recent news about this deal. Right, a prisoner exchange. So this was just announced on Monday. There have been murmurs and reporting about it for a long time, or a fair amount of time. So this is the Wall Street Journal's editorial page from today's. I actually have the hard copy here somewhere. Biden's $6 billion ransom to Iran. So they had a prisoner exchange, a prisoner swap. So 5 American citizens will be released, supposedly, by the Iranian government. In exchange, the U.S. will release 5, I believe it is 5 Iranians, and we have this prisoner swap, except, so it sounds like it's kind of an even deal, fair trade, but, and also as part of the deal, the U.S. has agreed to release $6 billion in funds that had been frozen as a part of the sanctions regime that the U.S. has imposed. So it's not, you know, the critics are saying the U.S. is giving Iran $6 billion. The administration, of course, is saying, no, no, no. This is Iranian money from Iranian oil sales that we froze and didn't allow them to access until they started doing what we want them to do. Then we'll release this money. And so the argument is, in this case, they're doing what we want them to do in terms of releasing 5 American prisoners. And so this temporary release of $6 billion of Iranian frozen assets. It's in so, and this, of course, is being attacked from the right. The Wall Street Journal editorial page, of course, is highly critical. And Republicans in Washington, of course, highly critical. Republican candidates running for the presidency, highly critical of this deal. And again, there's a similar dynamic. You're capitulating, you're giving in, right? We need to be tough with Iran. We don't need to be giving them $6 billion or releasing $6 billion of funds. We need to be getting tough on the Iranians. So definitely will be a domestic political issue, and this will be hammered by Republican candidates, I think, up until at least the election of 2024. All right. Yes, please. One's coming.
6 billion sounds like a lot. Do we have more
Billion.
do we have
Right.
more than
Yes.
6 billion that's frozen?
Yes, there are still sanctions in place. And it's been frozen in South Korean banks by multinational financial firms. So the U.S. said, we will impose, not just that in the U.S., U.S. banks or U.S. operating banks can't release, you have to freeze Iranian assets. But the U.S. through this sanction regime said, South Korea, you want our continued support and security assistance, right? Follow the sanction regime. So you also have to freeze these assets. Okay, a couple of bigger points, a couple of questions. And I know that we have a lot of good questions and comments, I'm sure. But I wanted to get to this question of, and it kind of goes back, one more piece of update in terms of bringing us to where we are. So it was in September of last year when these massive uprisings began. I had mentioned before, Mahsa Amini, this young Kurdish woman, Kurdish Iranian, was arrested for not wearing the hijab, not wearing the headscarf, and then died or was killed in police custody. And this sparked these massive uprisings. The biggest uprising throughout Iran's history. They've had periodic uprisings and protests and turmoil, but nothing like what we saw a year ago. There wasn't this kind of fomented uprising and protest since 1979. The government responds with brutal repression. Supposedly, reportedly, 500 protesters were killed by the government, by the regime, to put down the protests. And thousands, of course, were imprisoned, and it worked. The protest kind of fizzled out after 100 days or so. Now that we're coming up onto the anniversary of the death of Mahsa Amini, September 16th is the actual date, we're expecting to see renewed protests in Iran and maybe a repeat of what we saw in 2020. And of course, perhaps the hopeful folks like, maybe this is it, right? It makes me think of 1989 when we had these democratic revolutions throughout Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall comes down and democracy, people take to the streets demanding freedom, demanding democracy. And it was so incredible to watch. And then we start seeing demonstrations in Tiananmen Square in China. And I remember I was a college student, political science major. I'm watching this on TV going, oh my goodness, we're watching history. Like, I can't believe it. Democracy is coming to China? Wow. And then, of course, they sent in the tanks and the brutal repression, and people were murdered, civilians by the security forces and imprisoned. And the democracy movement was essentially squelched in China. And so it's unclear, sometimes the dictators, it works and people are repressed, and the demands for freedom, the demands for rights, the demands for democracy kind of go by the wayside. I also remember in 2011, during the Arab Spring, when the protests were spreading throughout the Arab world, starting in Tunisia and spreading throughout. I remember the protests in Tahrir Square in Cairo in Egypt, and the experts were, and it was hugely exciting, like, whoa, what's going on here? And all the experts were saying, don't worry, Mubarak's not going anywhere. These people, they're not, he's firmly in power, he's firmly entrenched. yeah, don't get excited. And a couple months later, Mubarak steps down from power. So we really don't know how these things are going to turn out. Also, I want to pose the question of should the United States support the protesters, right? Should the U.S. promote them? It's a fraught question because on the one hand, even if we say, yes, we believe in democracy, we believe in freedom, these guys are autocrats, they're radicals, they hate America. Yeah, we want to support the protesters who want democracy and freedom and rights. But how effective would that support be is an important question. So in a way, it almost proves the point, right, of the mullahs that, see, they're out to get us. They want to take us down. And so it's a troubling, it's a trade-off that with the United States, if we really truly favor democracy and we favor a democratic revolution and change within Iran, maybe we're best off by distancing ourselves from the protesters, because we don't want to prove the point of the Putins, of the Ayatollahs to say, yeah, see, we told you, the U.S. is behind all of this, right? This is just a power grab by the U.S. They don't care about democracy. They don't care about freedom. They care about power, and the U.S. is trying to expand its grip on power and its position of global hegemony. So the headline up here on, there's a picture of the protests last year. And so you see the headline, this happens to be from CNN. Iran rounds up activists and relatives of killed protesters ahead of Mahsa Amini's anniversary, the death of her anniversary. So clearly the government is expecting a renewal of these protests, whether it will happen, whether these kinds of arrests and the kind of surveillance state that they have in place, whether that will be effective and we won't see a mass uprising. I'll be watching this weekend. Right? This weekend will be fun to keep up with and see how that goes. One other point, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions, and that is the idea in terms of interest. So the U.S. foreign policy security interests in the region vis-a-vis Iran, yes, oil, yes, anti-terrorism, yes, we want to limit the influence of China and Russia. We want to support Israel. I mentioned, what about the freedom agenda, right? Do we have an interest in promoting democracy? But also, I want to highlight, which is not really mentioned too much in the presentation, the interest in stability and regional stability. So for many, myself included, during the Arab Spring, it was exciting. Wow, democracy, freedom, didn't really turn out that way. And we have civil war in Syria, we have civil war in Yemen, we have essentially an impasse of a civil war in Libya, and we have mass instability, political instability throughout the region, and this has led to a massive refugee crisis. And the problem of this political instability has bled over right into Europe, to the United States. It's a problem. And so some would argue what we want is just stability, right? We don't want a civil war. We don't want all this chaos. We don't want mass amounts of refugees spilling across borders. So yeah, it's exciting, right? It's really exciting to see what's going to happen here. And I always raise the question, to myself and to my students, what would you do? Like, I believe in democracy. I believe in freedom. I believe in standing up for your rights. I believe in fighting for your rights, right? Freedom is not free, this notion, right? I mean, if I were in Iran, would I take to the streets, right? Or would I say, wait a minute, last time they killed 500 people and they imprisoned thousands. I don't want that to be me. I mean, yes, I support democracy, but can I support democracy from my apartment? Can I just wish them good luck? Or do I have to, take to the streets and risk my life to fight for freedom and fight for rights and democracy? Okay, so let's see what kinds of questions, comments, thoughts, insights we have.
So in the film, there was a picture of Benjamin Netanyahu in front of the UN warning against Iran's close capability for nuclear weapons. Does Israel have nuclear weapons?
Yes, Israel is one of the 9 countries that's a member of the nuclear club. Sometimes it's referred to as the worst kept secret in the world, right? And that's intentionally so. So Israel has never formally acknowledged that, yes, we are a nuclear power, but they want everybody to know that they are a nuclear power. So they don't admit to it, because then they would open themselves up to inspections or some sort of oversight by the United Nations or countries that will want to do, find out the extent to their nuclear program. So they don't admit it, but they do want everyone, and particularly they want Iran to know that they have nuclear weapons. And so for many in the Middle East region and many Iranians, they'd be like, well, wait a minute. If Israel can have nukes, why can't we have nukes? Right? And maybe that would create a kind of balance of power that would prevent a war between Israel and Iran, somewhat like what we see with India and Pakistan, right? So these countries share a long border. They've been rivals and enemies, fought wars against each other. India gets a nuke, Pakistan gets a nuke, and they become nuclear powers, and they have not gone to, they have problems, a lot of problems, but they haven't fought an all-out war between them. And maybe it's a mutual deterrent in terms of the development of nukes. There's a hand over here.
I'm not asking you what your position is on all this, but we've talked about a lot about U.S. foreign policy, which, based on today's presentation, both by the resource person and yourself, is a moving target. So my question for you is, how do you present this to students? If you look at the U.S. position, which is a moving target, as was stated, depending on who is currently in the White House, if you look at administration, how do you help students navigate through and really have a good feeling on the U.S. position, which really applies to us as well. We're all students.
Yes.
But students in the classroom that you're trying to help them navigate through this, which is a mess.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to get through all of this and really know where you stand on it.
Right.
So how do you deal with that? What's your goal by the end of the semester, if it's a class,
right,
where you want the students to be moving forward?
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I think this is one example of what I'll do is present a variety of perspectives. Right? And I often talk about these perspectives, or you could say liberalism as a theory of global politics or international relations. It says realpolitik, but realism as a theoretical approach, and provide a variety of perspectives, or what I call lenses. So, and I say to students, it's not about necessarily determining who you think is right or wrong. Oh, the realists are right and the liberals are wrong, or whatever. But to say, when I put on these lenses and look through the world through a liberal lens, through the lens of liberal internationalism, what do I see? And then if I put on a different set of lenses and say, okay, now I'm looking at the world through a realist lens, then what do I see? And so my goal is to get them to understand that, and to understand where they're coming from, basically, what these perspectives actually are, and also to understand the perspectives of, okay, what is Putin? I'm not a fan of Putin, but what is his perspective? I don't want to be an apologist for the Iranian regime, but to try to understand from their perspective, what are they seeing when they look at the world? And I say, because we're humans, we naturally will decide what our opinion is and what our, what we think is the right decision or right or wrong. But that's not the point of the class, right? It's like you can do that on your own time. But my goal, what I want them to be able to do, is to understand these different perspectives, understand the different interests at play, and not necessarily try to judge the situation or determine who is right or who's wrong, or this is my position. Obviously, we do want them to think critically and develop ideas about the world, but that's not how I see my role. One thing I want to clarify and highlight, with realism argues as a school of thought that because of the anarchical nature of the international system, by which we mean essentially we don't have a world government, right? So the lack of this central authority, that's what we mean by anarchy in this case. Then nation states are required, almost forced, to pursue their own power and their own security. And from a realist perspective, power and security are relative. So it's a zero-sum game. If China is more powerful, the US relatively is less powerful. And we have this competition for power. If Pakistan increases its power, then India relatively is in decline in terms of its position of power. So it's a zero-sum game. And for realists, they argue this is just the way it is. You can think it's good or you can think it's bad, but we are realistically explaining how the world works. And so from this perspective, regime type, or the type of government you have, do you have a democracy or not? Regime type really doesn't matter all that much, because from a realist perspective, all states are faced with this dilemma, right? They're in an anarchical world. They have to provide for their own security, so they pursue power. And a state is a state as a state, or a nation state is a nation state as a nation state, whether you're a democracy, whether you're a monarchy, dictatorship, whatever. All states are essentially competing for power and security in the international arena. And from a liberal perspective, though, regime type matters a lot. So they would say, no, it's not the case that states are states are states. Actually, democracies behave differently, right? And it's not that democracies don't go to war or are more pacific, right? But that democracies don't fight wars against other democracies. So it matters. And so we have an interest in expanding this zone of democratic peace. So the liberal internationalists would point to World War II, right? Our two primary enemies were fascist states. What does the US do? Militarily occupies Germany and Japan, and then turns them into democracies. And for the most part, successfully. There's a case of successful democratization through US occupation, right? And so, and ever since, like flipping a switch, ever since, Germany and Japan have been allies with the United States. Oh, you're a democracy now. That means we're friends. We might have skirmishes, we might have disagreements, trade spats, whatever, but we don't have an $800 billion Pentagon budget because we're afraid that Japan, we might have to fight a war against Japan again, or that we're going to go to war against Germany again. So the idea is we have a security self-interest in promoting democracy and other places. And if you look today at potential US security threats coming from nation states, right? Who are the US's adversaries? Who are our potential enemies? China, certainly non-democratic. Russia, non-democratic, and increasingly so. Putin's moving to the totalitarian position quickly, right? North Korea, non-democratic. Iran, non-democratic. And so for liberals, they would argue this is not, that's not a coincidence, right? We have disagreements with democratic countries, but we don't see them as security threats that we're going to potentially fight a war against them. Other thoughts, comments? I wanted to recommend a documentary from Frontline, PBS's Frontline. Earlier this summer, they aired this Inside the Iranian Uprising. You see the description, trove of gripping footage filmed by protesters. Documentary goes inside the uprising, rocked Iran after the death of a young woman, sheds new light on a regime under unprecedented pressure. And I highly recommend this film, not in terms because of its analysis, but because of this, it makes it real. And it tells the story, and you get to know these people, and largely women. And this was kind of not really mentioned in the presentation, but what's amazing about this is that women are leading the way and in Iran, and they're leading the way by taking off their headscarves. And what a statement, what a political statement to walk the streets of Tehran without the hijab, to let your hair flow down. And it's really kind of, thinking about what would I do? I'm like, oh, I might just go along with it. I don't want to be thrown in prison. I don't want the morality police to show up and toss me in a van and bring me off somewhere. So whether we'll see again a repeat of this is pretty exciting. So I do recommend that film. Yes.
Joel, thank you very much for the way you're framing the issues. That the United States should be in favor of democracy, of working with people who are wanting to spread out the power and the control. It seems to me that what Christians need to do, and I am a follower of Jesus, I know that nations are going to fight against nations because they want control. The United States, as a powerful country, wants to protect its own integrity, its own independence, its own control. And so we are fearful of any who want to overthrow us. But what Christians need to do, in my view, in China, in Russia, in Iran, in Israel, in the United States, is work behind the scenes, loving one another, doing good to the enemy, feeding the hungry, taking the role of the marginalized, as did our Lord. And let that be what we do. Nations are going to fight against nations for control, and there's going to be death and mayhem and repression, and people are going to step from totalitarianism. You cannot protest against us.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's going to be death, and we are going to love one another. That's my point of view. And I know of a lot of people that I work with, the Words of Hope. We have so much going on in Iran now with people who are wanting to hear what Christians say about Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
And I love that about what's going on in Iran.
Yes.
And I don't know what the effect of the revolution in Iran is going to be.
Well, it's yeah, right. And I kind of was trying to make this point earlier about yes, we support the dignity of each human being, and we want to promote that around the world and treat people that way. But the realists would say, you're just going to cause more instability. You're going to just cause more war. They say, okay, just like why most realists were skeptical, if not outright opposed to the U.S. war in Iraq and even the U.S. war in Afghanistan. You're trying to democratize the world. You're tilting at windmills. You have these big ideas and dreams, but all you're going to do is cause instability, cause chaos. You're going to make it worse. Is what realists would say. So they would say it's not that we don't support democracy or human rights or freedom or everyone loving each other, but we want to be realistic about the situation, and that the cause of freedom could be at the risk of this instability and chaos. And the French Revolution turns into the reign of terror, and the problems are much worse, right? Even though you're trying to do the right thing or the good thing.
When they showed the history here, how after the Shah, the moderates started rising up, and it was taken over by the clerics and the extremists or something like that. Do you see any parallels to that within our own country here now and populism?
I haven't given that thought, but I would say as a political scientist that is not an unusual phenomenon, right? This idea that there's political change, there's upheaval, and then certain groups, whether it's Lenin in the Russian Revolution or wherever it is, then radical groups then often seize that opportunity and say, "Oh, here's our chance." We wouldn't have been able to topple the king ourselves or the Shah, right? But we now, in this period of instability, now we can move in and exert our will because, in part, we're willing to be more brutal than anybody else. So that is a common thing across countries that political scientists have observed. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I'm happy to stick around for a little bit if folks want to follow up on anything. Thank you all very much for your attendance and for your attention.
Well, Joel, I want to thank you personally for agreeing to come and give this talk today, and from the members of HASP in general for sharing your knowledge and the information, helping us to understand these problems a little bit better. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everybody.